Right, so in today's lesson, we are going to be multiplying numbers by powers of 10 by looking at patterns. So we're going to go back and take a look at place value before we jump into looking at whole number multiplication. We're just going to review the place value. And so if I have a number, so let's say that I have 32. Okay, and if I want to know what 32 is when I multiply it by 10, and what 32 is when I multiply it by 100, and if I have 32, and what it's going to be when I multiply it by 1,000. Okay, so when we do this, we are going to see, so if I have 32 multiplied by 10, my answer is going to be 320. If it's 32 multiplied by 100, it's going to be 3,200. If it's multiplied by 1,000, it's going to be 32,000. If I take it and I multiply 32 times 10,000, I end up with 320,000. So if we take a look at the pattern that happens each time, as I increase in place value, what's happening with my original 32 is each time my number is getting a 0. So here when I multiply by 10, it is now becomes 10 times as great. When I multiply by 100, it's now 100 times as great. When I multiply by 1,000, it's now going to be 1,000 times as great. And when I multiply by 10,000, it's now going to be 10,000 times as great. Okay, so every time that I multiply by 10, I'm going to add a 0. So here, because I have 1 0, I have a 0 here. Here, because I have 2 zeros, I have 2 zeros here. Here, because I have 3 zeros, I put 3 zeros on the end. And here, because I have 4 zeros, I put 4 zeros on the end of that number. So anytime you are multiplying by a place value, you're going to add the number of zeros that you multiplied by. So here, 1, I would add 1 here. Okay. If I take a look at this now by using my powers of 10, so if I have 32 times 1, that's going to be 32 times 10 to the 0 power, which is going to equal 32. If I have 32 times 10, if I write that using an exponent, it's going to be 32 times 10 to the first power, which is going to be 320. If I have 32 times 100, that's going to be 32 times 10 to the second power, or 3,200. 32 times 1,000 equals 32 times 10 to the third power, which equals 32,000. So if we stop and take a look, and let's take a look at the pattern that we see on this one. So I'm going to look specifically for patterns. I have 32 times 1, that's to the 0 power. So here, because it's times 1 to the 0 power, I didn't add any zeros. But here, I had times 10 to the first power, I added a 0. Here, 10 to the second power, I added 2 zeros. And 10 to the third power, I added 3 zeros. So this 3 zeros coordinates with my exponent of 3, which then coordinates with my 3 zeros on the end of my product. So whenever I'm multiplying by a power of 10, the exponent will tell me how many zeros I need to add to the end of that number. So because I had 3 here, I added 3 zeros. 1, 2, 3. So the exponent tells me the number of zeros, or if I'm multiplying by the place value itself will tell me how many zeros I add at the end of a number. Okay, so let's take a look. And if I have 60 times 1,000, right? So the 1,000 tells me that I'm going to have 3 numbers behind my value. So what I want to know is if I do this, 1, 2, 3, is this value correct? No, it's not. In order for it to be 6,000, it would have had to have been 6 times 1,000, right? Because then I can add my 3 zeros after. But because I had this 0 right here, I need to make sure that when I have a 0 as my last digit, that I include that in my number of zeros. So I have 60 times 1,000. So I rewrite my factor of 60, and then I add my 0. So I'm going to add 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3, my number now becomes 60,000. So anytime I have a 0 at the end of my factor that I'm multiplying by my place value or my exponent, I have to make sure that I include that 0. All right, so I'm now on your guided practice on page 115. And it says, how many zeros will there be in the product of 39 times 1,000? And how many zeros will be in the product of 50 times 1,000? So I'm going to count the total number of zeros that I have in 39 times 1,000. So I have 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to have 3 zeros here. Count my total number of zeros. 1, 2, 3 in the place value, but I also have to count this 0. So this one is going to be 4 zeros. Okay. The second question asks, explain how to find the product of 90 times 10 to the 4th power. So because they gave me the place value, or they gave me the exponent, the power of 10, I'm going to look here. So I'm going to look at the exponent. So that's the very first thing I'm going to do. I'm going to look at the exponent. Ran out of room. Then I'm going to add that number of zeros behind 90 to get 90,000. No, sorry, too many zeros, 900,000. So my answer there is going to be 900,000. All right, now I'm looking back at products. So I have 60 times 1, 60 times 10, 60 times 100, 60 times 1,000, and 60 times 10,000. I know those look like decimals, so I'm going to fix it. There we go. That's better. A little bit better of a comma. So 60 times 1 is 60. 60 times 10 is going to be 60, but then I add that extra 0 on. And then 60 times 100, so it's 60, and then I have 2 zeros, so I add on 2 more zeros. 60 times 1,000, I write my 60, add on 3 more zeros. 60 times 10,000, I have 60, and then I add on 4 more zeros. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to go back and put my commas where they need to go to make sure that I get them in the right spots so that my numbers are nice and easy to read. Okay? And then our fourth one. Now I'm going to be looking using powers of 10. So I have 13 times 10 to the power of 0, 13 times 10 to the power of 1, 13 times 10 to the power of 2, 13 times 10 to the power of 3, and then 13 times 10 to the power of 4. Okay? So when I look at this, again, the 0 here, these values, my exponents tell me how many zeros to place after the number 13. So if I have 13 times 10 to the 0 power, it's just going to be 13. I don't add any zeros. Here, I have 1, so I'm going to add 1 0. Here, I have 2, so I'm going to add 2 zeros. Here, I have 3, so I'm going to add 3 zeros. And on this last value, I have 4, so I'm going to add 4 zeros. Then I'm going to go back, put my commas in to make it nice and easy to read. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And that's where I have my answers. So again, when I'm multiplying numbers by powers of 10, I'm either going to use the exponent to tell me how many zeros to put behind my original number, or I'm going to use the place value itself. So we'll do one more example. So if I have 15 times 10 to the 3rd power, or 15 times 1,000, here the 3 tells me how many zeros to put. So I just need to look at the 3, and then I just need to write 1, 2, 3. On this one, when I multiply by the place value, I need to count. So I have 1, 2, 3. That means I need to put 3 zeros after the 15 for 1, 2, 3. Okay? So now you have learned how to multiply numbers by powers of 10 by looking at the patterns and using some of that multiple of 10 rule.